Jai Prabhuji. We are continuing our study of the Ishavasya Upanishad, and we're still debating the issue of the unity of the subject and object, which is coined by the term Purnam. Now, until now, we spoke about the philosophical aspects of it, how the subject and object can be one thing, but we didn't talk about the psychological aspect of it, or the psychological effect of this duality. We were talking in a very high philosophical term, but not actually getting to something that applies to our daily life. Like what all this, how does it manifest in our day-to-day life? It may seem that this discussion of Brahman and the duality of the question of duality of subject and object is very academic, but actually it's not. And there is a very simple and close to us aspect which is derived directly from this idea of idam and adaha, of subject and object. And to understand it better, we continue reading in the book. The experience of a difference between subject and object conflicts with the assertion in the Upanishad that the essence of both the observer and the observed is Purnam. And this is the theme that we were investigating. Diversity necessarily implies limitation. Here's a new idea. Diversity implies limitation. So if we see limitation in life, it is because of this duality, because of this diversity. As long as we feel limited and incomplete, we will continue to strive to escape such a feeling and try to complete ourselves through different means that supposedly offer temporary satisfaction. The dissatisfaction that accompanies human being comes from limited self-perception. So we can see here a few interesting things. So notice the use of the word dissatisfaction. Prabhuji chooses to write dissatisfaction when he is describing life as we know it. And why is it interesting? Because he chooses to write dissatisfaction and not use the word in this context like suffering or pain. And that is significant because suffering is something that we hear a lot in the context of a spiritual knowledge, especially talking about this. And many masters and scriptures described the predicament of the human being as being nothing less than a torment. For example, the Dhammapada, there's a verse that equates the world, not equates, but says that the world is burning. And it says, how can you have laughter or joy when the world is burning? Because obviously when the world is, if there's a fire, you have to escape. You can't wait, you can't enjoy life, you have to escape that situation. And that's obviously a Buddhist text, and it goes directly to the first teachings of Buddha about the Four Noble Truths. And the first noble truth is dukkha, which means suffering or pain. And you can find the same urgency to escape suffering in Hinduism in the whole idea of escaping samsara. And so it's not only that we suffer one lifetime, we have to suffer again and again and again and again, almost interminably, and that is horrible, obviously. But instead of that, Prabhuji uses the word dissatisfaction. And the word dissatisfaction, if you place the word dissatisfaction next to suffering, dissatisfaction seems much more soft, much more, the satisfaction is something that you can live with. But suffering is obviously something that you cannot live with. If we imagine suffering to be like fire, like the Dhammapada says, it's obviously that you cannot stand inside flames. You cannot be in fire, because you have to escape. That even a little match that you light will cause you enough pain to escape. But however, you can spend a very long and miserable life in dissatisfaction. You can even achieve all the goals that you have set for your life, and then arrive at the end looking back and feeling totally dissatisfied. And this can, and maybe we don't see it in ourselves, but we can see it in other people that looked back when they reached a very old age. They look back at their life, and although they say they might have achieved all the things that, society seems to be the things that's supposed to make us happy, and still they feel dissatisfied. So Prabhuji is talking, I think, about this kind of dissatisfaction, not about pain or suffering that you need to escape now, but a dissatisfaction that goes deeper than that, that is more of an existential feeling of dissatisfaction. And Prabhuji writes, the pursuit of pleasure, enjoyment, and happiness is intimately linked to this sense of limitation. According to Vedanta, such a search is futile because we are eternally unlimited. So what this means is that we pursue after pleasure and happiness because we feel limited. And the fact is that in truth we are actually unlimited, but obviously we don't feel that. So that's why we feel the limitation, and that's what makes us run after pleasure. So here we begin with a thing that is very close to all of us, because everybody pursue pleasure and happiness and enjoyment, everyone. Everyone has a different way of pursuing that, different things that he feels or believes that they will be giving him happiness and pleasure and stuff. Not everybody likes the same things, obviously. But everybody is linked, is united by the urge, by that pursuit. That is maybe the only truly universal things that can connect all human beings, is that search for happiness. Now, if we want to see an example that takes this and puts it extremely clear and obvious out to the open, it is the phenomenon of addiction. Now, what is the difference between addiction and normal pursuit of enjoyment or happiness? The only difference is the amount of desperation the addicted person feels. When the desperation to achieve that fix, that thing that we desire, grows to such an intensity, the desperation is so intense that it forces the person to act in a way that might not be good for him or for his environment. It makes him ignore any consideration for the consequences. That is what we see when addiction comes to its most mature expression. Now, I do not claim or pretend to be an expert in addiction or to give advice on how to deal with addictions. I'm only taking this example of addiction because it is extreme, and because we can see the whole process easier when something is more extreme, something is more pronounced. Now, in addiction, we notice it when the behavior becomes unmanageable, when things get out of control. Even if it's something that other people don't notice and only we notice that we don't have control of our lives. And then usually is when people start looking for ways out. We said that the addiction is an example, and the reason for that is that when you start reading and seeing the cases of people who suffer different kind of addictions, you see that the object they are addicted to can be different. One can be addicted to drugs, one can be alcohol, one can be gambling, computer games, relationship, and then you can see that you see many expressions of addiction, but the addiction itself, the phenomena, is very similar. And it always comes to a point where the reasons that a person falls into addiction is because something is missing in their life. There is that very deep dissatisfaction, even pain, that the object they're addicted to is used in order to give some temporary relief to that limitation. How is that related to our discussion of the Upanishad? Because the Upanishad, when we are jumping a bit ahead, we're in the invocation, but the first mantra of the Upanishad, part of the mantra is saying this, is saying, therefore enjoy renunciation, or enjoy renouncing. And you can think that renunciation and addiction is like two opposites. It's exactly the opposite direction. So let's see what Prabhuji writes about this. If we observe ourselves through a limited mind and imperfect senses, we feel confined by the limits of time and space. Believing ourselves to be a separate subject, disconnected from the objective world, we feel something is missing. So you can see here the connection to the invocation. We're kind of getting into what this disconnection creates. In the invocation, we were talking about all the time about subject and object being the one thing. Here, we are investigating, Prabhuji is investigating what happens when we believe ourselves, we have this experience that we are a subject separated from the objective world. And he writes, when we perceive our own limitations, the sensation of scarcity, restriction, discomfort, disconnection, and insufficiency emerge. Our ability for self-observation induces us to a deep dissatisfaction and uneasiness because we feel confined in physical bodies and endowed with limited knowledge. This is very important. Our ability for self-observation. We have an ability to see ourselves. Even, and we're not talking about being very much aware, because sure, let's take the example of the addicted person. Most addicts in the beginning say, no, I'm not an addict. I can stop whenever I want. And of course, we lie to ourselves in many things. This is, as I said, an extreme example. An extreme example is easier to see than small examples. But in what Prabhuji is saying is that deep down we cannot really lie to ourselves because we have an ability to self-observe. And we see, if we are honest with ourselves, we see that there is a dissatisfaction and uneasiness because of our situation being limited in a body, and everything is limited to our knowledge is limited, everything is limited. And that is basically what Prabhuji is saying. We see the condition of being a subject, and we see that subject is limited, and that brings that dissatisfaction. Prabhuji continues to, we try to complete ourselves with the objective world, finding only frustration in the end. See, so before he talked about dissatisfaction, here he's talking about frustration, the same thing. The disappointment is due to the fact that nothing and no one can complete us, because we are already complete. By renouncing our efforts to achieve happiness and security through this objective world, we shall enjoy without feeling disappointed. Renouncing the inclination to try to complete ourselves is a sign of spiritual maturity. If we have addiction on one end of a spectrum, we will have renunciation on the other side. Not exactly. Posing the things like that suggests that renunciation and addiction, or if we take it to a more tepid description, is like desires and the renunciation of them are in a conflict, are fighting against each other. And Prabhuji doesn't exactly speak about that. He doesn't speak about a conflict, because we are trying to actually, in discovering our nature, we are going through a process which is not we're going through a process which is not adding more conflict, but exactly the opposite, dissolving the conflict that already is. Because by being a subject, we are in a conflict with the objective world, because objects are either things that we desire or things that threaten us in some way. So the minute we get into this world of subject and object, we're already in conflict. And Prabhuji here says something also very significant, is that renunciation is more a sign of maturity. So, and maturity doesn't come from conflict, because Prabhuji gives a lot of this example of a child, that two brothers, and one is a little older than the other, and usually they fight over toys, who gets to play with the toys and stuff. And one day the older brother comes home and he doesn't want to play with the toys, and the younger brother is doesn't understand how come the older brother is not running after the toys like always. And it comes to him, and the older brother says, "No, it's fine. You play with the stuff. I don't want it." And it's like, the older brother went crazy. What's happening? Why is he not interested in the toys like before? And what happened is that the older boy matured a little bit, and he began to be interested in other things, and he saw a beautiful girl, and he's thinking about her, and now the toys of his youth are less important. So it's not that he renounced as from a conflict as like, I'm not going to play with the ball anymore. It was a maturity, a certain maturity that happened naturally that made him renounce in a very natural way those toys. That is more of the direction that Prabhuji usually talks about. And we have here the idea of completion. Prabhuji talks about completion, which, again, as we saw, is derived directly from the idea of Purnam. Purnam means complete. And we saw before that it means that subject and object, what can be more of opposite than subject and object, is actually one. And in the commentary to the first mantra, he writes, our original nature of unlimited bliss prompts us to seek happiness and avoid suffering. We are constantly trying to escape from the uncomfortable situation in which we believe we are constrained by a form. Nothing and no one in the objective world is able to free us from the pursuit of pleasure and enjoyment. This destitution is inherent in our slavery. Instead of condemning efforts to satisfy the senses, Vedanta focuses on a deep understanding of the nature of desire. It does not suggest a blind and ignorant repression of desire, but a liberation from constantly pursuing them. So notice that Prabhuji writes that nothing and no one can liberate us from the pursuit of pleasure. Remember when we talked before about that the pursuit of pleasure comes from that limitation between subject and object. That state of duality, that is what creates the pursuit of pleasure, because it creates a feeling of that something missing, that we want to complete ourselves. And here he writes that nothing can liberate us from this pursuit of pleasure, which means you cannot repress. If there was a way of liberating from the pursuit of pleasure, meaning that there is a way of never having desires for that pleasure, for that enjoyment, in some way, there was like some magical technique that we can do and then no more desires. But it's impossible. Because the condition that we are in, the way the thing works, that creates that seeking for pleasure. And yes, every person seeks happiness and pleasure in different things, but the same desire unifies everyone. And if we apply this to the discussion of addiction, we know that a person can stop himself and somehow and restrain this behavior and not use his thing and not fall for his addiction. But the urge is always there. And then there's a common saying that's saying once an addict, always an addict, because the urges, the desires for fulfilling those things that led the person to his addiction, they stay. So you have to replace them with something more healthy. And again, addiction is an extreme example, but with every person we see the same thing. The urge to be happy, the urge to find pleasure and enjoyment in some way to alleviate, that's something that all of us share. Prabhuji, he wrote that Vedanta is not talking about a blind repression. And again, I want to emphasize again that I'm not saying all this as some kind of advice on how to deal with addictions. Not at all. Because I don't think it is. We are only talking about this as a way of understanding more the topic. Now, the whole issue of desires and this issue of repressing them and not repressing them, I want to jump a little bit from the discussion in the Ishavasya Upanishad and talk about and read a few things from Prabhuji's book Tantra, Liberation in the World. Because the Tantric approach, actually, the philosophical basis of the Tantric approach is very similar to the ideas in the Ishavasya Upanishad. In the Ishavasya Upanishad, we have idam and adaha, this and that, the subject and object. And in the Tantric traditions, we have a similar idea which is portrayed in the division between Shiva and Shakti. Shiva and Shakti are the two forces that bring about the creation, and in many ways they are described almost the same, in almost the same words as like the subject and object. Okay? So I'm going to read from the third chapter, which is titled Shiva Shakti, the non-dual tantric polarity. According to the tantric vision, the original source of the objective universe is a single absolute principle called Shiva Shakti, or the consciousness energy principle. The apparent separation of the cosmic manifestation is present in every human being. Therefore, we constantly strive to return to the original unity from which the apparent emerged. We find it difficult to grasp the idea that two opposite principles interacting harmoniously. Perceiving ourselves only as parts, we think we are limited, and this keeps us in a state of constant dissatisfaction. The egoic phenomena stems from this partial self-perception. We believe we are disconnected from everything and everyone. As long as that fracture persists, we will continue to live as parts and perceive life from a partial perspective. It is impossible to realize the absolute if our fragmentary experience shows us a world of opposites. As you can see, in the Tantric tradition, we see something extremely similar to what we were saying in the Ishavasya Upanishad, the idea of a subject and object and a separation that brings about everything, and also the feeling of dissatisfaction that comes from being limited, from perceiving yourself as only as a part. And what's interesting in the Tantric tradition is that and Prabhuji is saying here, it is impossible to realize the absolute if our fragmentary experience shows us a world of opposites. So, as long as we see opposites, as long as we have this vision that is subject and object, it's impossible for us to realize the absolute. And Prabhuji writes in the same chapter a bit more about this idea. Tantra aims for the ultimate reality, where all conflicts disappear and are revealed to be complementary. So you see here, this is every sentence is important. That conflicts disappear. The conflicts between subject and object, the conflicts that we live inside, disappear. And what is revealed is that all of this is complementary. In Tantric sublimation, the positive expresses itself in its infinity until the negative disappears. The immensity of the divine can absorb the mundane. Just as light dispels darkness, falsehood vanishes into the truth, and what is makes every absence disappear. Tantra tells us not to fear the negative, but to let it have a place within the positive. It lets illusion be part of the real, because in the end, only what is real will remain. This path creates the conditions for us to become aware that we are immersed in this divine game of relativity. Tantra invites us to undertake an exciting exploration, free of the repressive and condemnatory attitude so characteristic of other religions. Tantra assures us that the opposites are reconciled in the original source. And this is what I was hoping to get to. Here, we need to understand this very, very clearly. As Prabhuji writes, the path can create the conditions for us to become aware that we are immersed in this divine game of relativity. So, if before we talked about us being the subject and the object, and we are constantly, stuck in one end of this game, we're either trying to be just the subject or either trying to be in the objects to experience them, and we're like constantly going in one direction or the other. Here is something else. Here is like Prabhuji is right. The path can create the conditions for us to become aware that we are immersed in this divine game of relativity. We are immersed in the game. There is a game, yes, of subject and object, of objects, but we are inside of it. And then he says Tantra invites us to undertake an exploration, free of the repressive and condemnatory attitude. Exploration that is free from repression. Now, here is something that we need to really understand very clearly. That, okay, now we're seeing that if before we were thinking that because there is subject and object, we feel this limitation, we feel that there's something needs to complete us, and we are running after completion. And then the Upanishad says, so enjoy renouncing, meaning forget about that what Tantra is calling the game. Forget about it. Just, don't bother about. Don't run after the objects. But as Prabhuji is saying, we can't do that because we can't escape this pursuit of enjoyment. And in the example of the addiction, it's like saying the urge is still there. Okay, so you won't touch that thing, you won't touch gambling or something, but the urge will be there and it will express in other ways. So if it's not going to express through, let's say, smoking, it will express in gambling. If it won't express in gambling, it will express in... Because the pursuit is something that no one can take out of us. So, what can we do? And again, this is not a way to get out of addiction. And this is why. Because we're not talking about... One thing to understand here is if we're looking for results, if we're looking for a benefit, a method that will make our lives better, this is not the way. This is not what Prabhuji is talking about. Prabhuji writes here that Tantra invites us to an exploration, an exciting exploration. Exploration is in order to discover, to gain wisdom, to gain insight, not in order to solve a problem. If we have a problem, for example, again, I'm getting the example of addiction. If we have a problem with some addiction, exploration is not the way to solve it. There's other ways to solve it, and there are good ways, and but that's not what we're talking about, and not what we're suggesting. We're talking about an exploration. And in exploration, what is important is, in the Tantric vision, in the Tantric way of exploration, is not to repress. But this is usually understood in a very manipulative way. Because he's saying, okay, not to repress, then I can do whatever I want, and I can, enjoy and go. And that's usually how people understand Tantra. They take it as a way to justify whatever behavior they want. Because I'm not repressing, so I can do whatever I want. And this is not what Tantra is. And this whole book is basically showing, among other things, that point. It's about, when Prabhuji talks about acceptance, he's talking, from what I understand, about observing everything. Meaning observing the good and the bad in us. We don't want to see parts of ourselves. We spoke about addiction. Addiction is one of the most ugly things that you can see on yourself. No one wants to say he's addicted. No one wants to admit that. That is usually the most difficult part. That's why many of these groups of dealing with addictions are anonymous. Why is it anonymous? Because it gives the freedom to see without being judged. Because if there is something that is on the opposite side of acceptance, it's judgment. And Tantra is first of all saying, look at yourself without that judgment. So see the good and see the bad. See everything. Not as a way of justifying behavior, not as a way of now I can do whatever I want, but as a way of really watching. And that's why he's saying exploration, because you're exploring. Exploring and seeing what is. When you explore, if you really explore, you will discover things that are beautiful and things that are not beautiful. You don't know what you're going to discover because you go on an exploration. It's like the first people who went into, the unknown places, the first people who reached the Amazon rainforest and places like that, and no one been there before. You don't know what you're going to find. You might find, some beautiful things or some, disgusting mushrooms. You don't know what you're going to find. So, and the idea of acceptance is to be able to see everything and not to hide anything. And we need to understand this, because if we understand this tantric vision as a way of, okay, now I can do whatever I want, I can go after my desires without any limit. Think about if you're taking an addict and you're saying that to an addict, saying, do whatever you want with your addiction. It's obvious that is disastrous. That is the last thing an addict can do or needs to do, is to go after without any restraint on this thing. But something that is important is to be able to look at yourself in honesty, the good and the bad, to see all the problems, all the issues. And for that, you need to accept. You need acceptance to be able to do that. With that, we can understand what Prabhuji writes here. We believe we are disconnected from everything and everyone. As long as that fracture persists, we will continue to live as parts and perceive life from a partial perspective. It is impossible to realize the absolute if our fragmentary experience shows us a world of opposites. And Prabhuji, this is what Prabhuji is talking about here. It's impossible to, the realization will be impossible if we see a world of opposites. In a way, Prabhuji always talks about observing ourselves as if we are something there, something that we can observe. He a lot gives this example of looking at yourself like a little child. A little child that wants things, that we talked about all the time, about this pursuit of pleasure, the pursuit of things, and that we cannot escape it. And he always says, he many times says, look at yourself like you're a little child that wants whatever you want, but as a little child. And see that it's just a simple child desiring something. And yes, that something might be stupid and not important and, foolish. But if you look at that that way, you look with judgment, and you start separating between good things and bad things. It's bad to desire, smoking, but it's good to desire studying and knowledge. You start dividing the experience. Like Prabhuji says, to fragment the experience into a world of opposite. There is a good things, there's bad things. He says, no, just look at the whole thing. Because anyway, you cannot escape the pursuit of pleasure. You can't. As long as you're as long as you're in this duality of subject and object, of there's me and there's the world, you can't escape. Try to see the world from a different way, even just as a kind of a mental experiment. To see the things in a different way, to be able to learn and gain insight. Because in the end, this insight, this understanding is what can help us. Not if we repress, not if we go after it, not if we manage to stop something or don't manage to stop something. What really is important is to know ourselves, to have more wisdom and understanding on ourselves. And usually we don't do it because usually we want a solution. We want a solution for our problems. We want to stop with the things that are bad for us. We want to add the things that are good for us, which is good. But if you want to understand, to know, and I believe that Prabhuji that is the essence of his Tantric vision, is to learn more about yourself, to understand more yourself. Then you need to accept everything and just observe. Jai Prabhuji.